in one of the important yet underreported stories of this week, Great Britain is about to vote on whether or not to remain within the European Union. They call it Brexit, a British exit from the European community. And here to discuss the potential implications of that action with us now is Jeff Faux. Jeff Faux founded the Economic Policy Institute in 1986 with our mutual friend Roger Hickey and made it the country's leading think tank on political and economic issues. He's written a number of books, including The Servant Economy, where America's elite is sending the middle class. He's worked in a number of government departments, including state, labor, and commerce, and he joins us now. Jeff, thanks for coming on the program.
Good to be here, Richard.
So, I guess one of the questions that I've had is, without being reflexively pro or con on anything, I like to know, what do economists I largely agree with in terms of values and principles think about the idea of Brexit? I've heard that a British exit would be the quote-unquote left thing to do because it's more democratic. I've heard that it would get people out from the oppressive thumb of the Germans. And you've made a different point. You've suggested that Brexit would hit the British economy much harder than people realize. What's your thinking there?
Yeah, well, I think it's a close call for the left in Britain. But in the end, I think that the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn came out on the right side, which is to vote no on Brexit. That is, to vote to keep Great Britain in the European Union. You get economists, as you know, will give you any opinion you want. But you do have a complex situation here. On the one hand, the Germans and the German bankers and the multinational corporations have, no question about it, inordinate power in Brussels and at the level of the European Union. On the other hand, for Britain, it's the European Union's worker protections that have made life better for British workers. The European Union has mandated vacations, anti-discrimination law, parental leave, and other protections that I think the Labour Party rightly understands would not have come unless they were part of the European community. So it's not an easy call because it's as life, it's complicated. But I think that the right call for the British left is what the Labour Party is doing, and that is opposing Brexit.
We're talking with the economist Jeff Faux, and Jeff, you make an interesting point I hadn't considered before. I guess my thinking on the European community has been shaped a lot by the experience of some of the heavily debtor nations, like Greece being the most extreme example, where I feel the Troika and others have acted in an enormously undemocratic way, the Germans in particular. And it seems to me, when you have the IMF as the voice as the voice of the left in an internal argument, things have gone seriously off the rails, and that's what we see in Greece. But I hadn't thought about the fact that membership in the European community for Great Britain, which has spent so much of the last 50 years under the rule of the Tories, might be a very heavily moderating influence. I guess that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, you look at what is motivating the anti-EU movement in Great Britain. First, it's anti-immigration. This is not about democracy. It's about keeping those people out of Britain. So it's a very right-wing campaign. You can make a case, of course, for localism any place, but to argue that the British Tories, which pretty much have dominated the politics of England over the last 50 years, that the British Tories would somehow, once freed from the European community, then not go after the British workers, I think is naive.
Right. Right. It would, it suggests.
and loses the privileges that it has to access European markets, it's going to mean that the British economy is going to have to compete more with China and Asia and everybody else in the world without the protections of the European community, which I think is going to end up with more of a race to the bottom. It's again, it's not an easy call, but that's where I think a sensible leftist would come out.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and it helps me understand Corbyn's thinking better too, and that of his wing of the Labour Party. One would not want the Tories in Great Britain to give full vent to their Dickensian predilections, for lack of a better description.
Exactly.
And then there's a question that you've also written about of the impact of a Brexit on the British economy, and you touched on it in your last comments, but your thinking is it would be a lot worse than a lot of people are predicting, right?
Yeah. Now in the long run, as Keynes said, we're all dead, so who knows? But in the short run, it's clearly going to bring a period, probably at least 2 years, maybe 5 years, of uncertainty about the British economy and to some degree the European economy, which means that investors will be shy. And it means that, for example, starting a business in Britain, you don't know what the rules are yet because, what is going to take the place of the European community protections. So you can expect a hit on the British economy, some hit, I think, on the European economy, but that depends on how they respond, and much less here in the United States. The other thing about Britain is that I think leaving the EU will make it more dependent on the United States, where the ruling class is on economic matters even more conservative than the Germans or the French. So the average worker in Great Britain, I think, would be in for some strained times over the next few years if they pull out.
Yeah, well, I appreciate those thoughts because they give me a lot of insight on this. I should know the answer to this, but maybe I assume you do. Jeff Faux, which is where? Yeah, let's see. Right. If you don't, we'll look it up. Where do the Scottish independence movement folks come out on Brexit?
Well, this is another issue because the Scots, having their own issues with the English, say that if the British leave the EU, they will have a referendum to go themselves into the EU, which would mean Scottish independence. So there's a hornet's nest out there. The Scots tend to be more leftist, and they certainly would rather be at the mercies of Brussels than totally at the mercies of London. So you could make a case, who knows the future, but you could make a case that this could endanger the unity of the British Isles.
Yeah, it is a fascinating set of issues. Have you debated any leftists who are on the other side of this issue? And if so, what have they tended to throw at you as counterarguments?
Well, I think the counterarguments from the left are that, as you said at the beginning, the European Union has been brutal to some of those debtor nations. The counterargument is that the European Union is totally controlled by German capital, and they're going to continue to do what they do. And I think, there's some truth to that. On the other hand, it may be, looking at the bright side of my argument, it may be that if this is defeated, the sort of right-wing sector of the British economy might go back, under the woodwork and leave some room for people like Corbyn and others to begin the process that I think is needed, and that is for a true labor movement across the European community. I mean, that's the thing that's missing. You've got the capitalists united from Britain to Romania, but not labor. And I think the real challenge to labor and the hope for the future is that you begin to manifest the dream of a labor movement and a people without the nationalist borders.
Well, it's a fascinating thought. Any hope for it occurring? I've always felt that international coordination is one of the big dreams and big weaknesses of the labor movement today. It's as you say, not just in obviously the European community, capital has kind of formally come together, whereas labor has not even, as far as I know, informally come together. But globally, of course, capital has come together too. So, any chance that could ever become a reality, as long as we're dreaming?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a chance, and there are people in all labor people in all of those countries who understand the need for that kind of collaboration. Obviously, the odds are against it, but the odds are always against progress. So, so there you have it. I think that the other problem here is incipient nationalism, not only in Britain but in Europe as well. And just before the treaty that it's established the euro, I had a conversation with an Italian senator who was the head of their foreign affairs committee. And we're having lunch, and I said, I look at this as an economist, and I don't see what's in it for Italy to join the eurozone. And he said, well, you may be right about the economics, he said, but we've had 2 world wars on this continent, in the last 100 years, and we don't want another one. And I think there is another issue here, and that is anything that starts to split up the at least politically successful in terms of politics among nations, unity in Europe, I just think is sowing seeds for a future danger.
Yeah, well said. Although, of course, we have to balance that with making sure that unity is governed democratically and with fairness for all the entities in it.
But, Richard, just a point on that. That is a fundamental issue for us. And that is, on the one hand, we want to maximize democracy. And the way you maximize it, obviously, is to have smaller and smaller units. On the other hand, the smaller and smaller units don't necessarily give us the sort of humanitarian and just society that we want. It was local democracy, in the 1960s that really had to be smashed by the U.S. federal government in order to combat Jim Crow. So this is there's not a quick, glib left answer to this thing, and I wish there were. But it's you got to balance this thing, and the parallel in with Britain, for example, is workers get protections under the European community, under those bureaucrats at the European community that they wouldn't get under their elected officials.
Yeah, and whatever protections they'd get if the Tories took over would be privatized anyway, so they wouldn't last too long, right? So, all right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. But Jeff Faux, economist, founder of the Economic Policy Institute, author. Thanks for coming on the program.
Good to see you, Richard.
Good to see you too.